And today is Friday, September the 25th, the year 2020. Hello and welcome to this edition of the Brian on Baseball podcast. I'm Brian Gadsword, as amazingly enough, we have hit the final weekend of this 60-game regular season already. It feels like just yesterday that we were going through the longest off-season ever, and now pretty soon we're headed for another off-season. But before we get to that, we get to what should be a wild month of October with a 16-team playoff field where there is a lot of intrigue and still a lot to be decided, especially on the National League side of things, and we're going to spend some time on that, digging into the teams that are still alive, who's clinched, who hasn't, who still has a chance, and like I said, on the National League, still a lot to know. The American League looks pretty well settled with the 8 teams. You pretty much know 7 of the 8 have clinched, and I don't think anybody expects any team on the outside looking in to sneak their way in on the American League side. So we'll take a look at the postseason picture a little bit later. Plus, we'll have this day in baseball history, where today's note comes from something in the relatively recent past. Couple notable retirements as well that we'll get to, so a lot on tap on the show today. But I want to start with something that I didn't get a chance to get to last week, and I meant to because it had been in the news, and that is in regards to the Mets and their new ownership, which we understand the agreement has been reached for Steve Cohen to take over the reins as the new owner, and the last step is for him to get approval by the rest of the owners, or at least 23, I think is the number that it has to be in order to be approved as a new owner. And so all indications are that will get done probably sometime end of October, early November. And the reaction among the fan base has been, well, jumping up and down. And to a degree, I understand it. I think more than anything else, it's just the fact that the Wilpons are out of there, and this team is, and its fan base is just so overjoyed that it's just anybody taking over, because we know the Wilpons have just been pinching pennies for years. It is not a team that has spent big, hasn't spent like a true New York market team, and that has drawn the ire of this fan base. And, you know, there's been a lot of up and down results, mostly down, as we know, through the years under their reign. So any kind of fresh blood to take that spot is cause for celebration, seemingly, with this group. Now, I don't think it's going to happen overnight where all of a sudden the Mets are back to being a powerhouse, back to being an elite team. I just think it takes more than having somebody come in who has a ton of money, as we know. And one thing that is good about him is the background of being a New York guy and being a fan of the team. You have to like that on a lot of levels because he's passionate about the team. He wants to see what's best for his team because of those roots. But my point would be, some of the teams that have spent big in recent years, it hasn't necessarily translated to wins. I mean, you think about a team like the Angels, they've given out a ton of big contracts in recent years, and it has not led to any winning whatsoever. They've only been in the playoffs once in Mike Trout's great career, and you think of some of the deals they handed out that did not work out. I talked about Albert Pujols last week. Josh Hamilton is another one. Pitching-wise, the deal to C.J. Wilson. So they've spent big money recently, and it just hasn't worked. The biggest key for teams that are winning now in baseball is the farm system, is developing a core nucleus of players that all get to the big leagues, you hope, around the same time and produce a winner over an extended period. That's what you've seen with the Chicago Cubs, how they ended their 108-year curse, Kansas City Royals, the Houston Astros. All of these teams took steps back big time, where they lost year after year, were the bottom of the barrel, were consistently picking toward the top of the draft. They built up the farm system. A lot of the picks worked out, still a lot that didn't, but you've identified that core group, and that becomes what you win with. And I think that's the key to building a team more than anything else right now. And you look at the Mets, do they have a core? Somewhat. They have a stable of young players that has kind of come to the fore this year and produced some really good results. But I don't know that I look at that group and say it is championship material. And I think this team still has a long way to go. I think they have to build up the depth within the organization, pitching-wise, they're pretty stripped down to the bare bones right now. And so I just think it's going to take more than bringing in a guy who has a ton of money, going out in free agency, and the big rumor is the Mets are going to throw big money at JT Realmuto. I'd be all for that. He's a player that I've liked since his career started with the Marlins. You think he's the best catcher in the game by a pretty wide margin right now. But free agency, there's not a whole lot of big names out there come this offseason. So, yeah, you can go out and get Realmuto and maybe pay George Springer significant dollars. But does that vault you to the top of the division where you have the Braves and other teams? I just don't necessarily think so. I think it's going to be something that takes more time than that. But I understand the feeling among the fan base that just the fact getting the Wilpons out of there and getting somebody new, and you like a lot of the things that you hear about him, is eventually, you hope, going to lead to a consistent winner. I just would caution that I don't think overnight you can expect, boom, this team's going to be a 95-win team next year after they go out and spend big in free agency, because I just don't necessarily think that makes the team that much better. And then the other thing with that came out recently is that should Cohen be approved as the new owner, the guy that he is going to bring in, he pretty much officially announced as the president of baseball operations, is somebody that we know very well, and that's Sandy Alderson, which is something that, again, here I have mixed feelings on. The Sandy Alderson era was very interesting because I think we look now that it's more successful at the time than when he was actually running things. Because, yes, the Mets got to a World Series in 2015. They came back and made the playoffs the following year, albeit losing in the wild card game. But a lot of those years, it was frustrating to watch. And the big thing was they didn't do much of anything as far as signing free agents. But what you came to realize is that what Sandy's strength was drafting, because now the guys that are having an impact, Michael Conforto, Dom Smith, Brandon Nimmo, were all Sandy Alderson guys. And so that's the thing more than anything else that stands out, is the team that's producing right now, especially offensively, is largely due to the previous regime in Alderson as opposed to Brodie Van Wagenen, who there really hasn't been a whole lot he's done that's impacted this team in a positive way, let's be honest. So I'm okay with the idea of Sandy coming back. I just thought that the Mets would swing bigger here. You bring in a guy with big money like Steve Cohen who can go out and have anybody he wants. You know, I read different things that said the Mets should target Theo Epstein, who that would, to me, would be a big-time move, a guy who ended two curses in Boston and Chicago, building up those teams and is seen as one of the top executives maybe in the history of the game. Him getting a chance to run a New York team, that could be big time. So I just thought there was a chance to do something that could stand out more. There's other young GMs who are very much on the rise. You think of David Stearns in Milwaukee, Mike Chernoff in Cleveland, the chance to maybe lure them away for the opportunity to run a New York club. That would be very attractive. So I think the Alderson move is an okay one. I just think the Mets could have swung bigger here just because we know already what we had with Sandy Alderson. Now, the one difference is now he gets a chance to take over with an owner who supposedly is going to open up the checkbook, and that potentially would allow him to make more substantial moves. The thing I don't like here, though, is I feel like the Mets have this fascination in recent years of bringing in people that were already part of the organization that, let's face it, most of the time were in losing seasons, and then coming back and bringing them back after they left. And I just don't necessarily like that strategy. You know, they did it with Omar Minaya. He ran the team, had his share of ups and downs. Then he left, went to a couple different teams, and the Mets brought him back to work with Alderson at one point again. Player-wise, they've done the same thing. Jose Reyes was a great player for this team in his heyday. They didn't want to pay him as a free agent. The Marlins did. He bounced around a little bit, and then after his domestic dispute, nobody wanted him, and the Mets went and scooped him back up. Why? This year they went out and brought back Todd Frazier in a trade. They just seem to have this fascination where they have guys, they let them go, and then they bring them back, and I just don't necessarily understand that perspective. But to me, the thing that I like most about bringing Alderson back is the fact that it's now a fresh start with a new owner with the potential to make more noise than when he was under the Wilpon regime, and you knew he was hamstrung with what he could do. And, you think of some of the moves he made as a GM in his first go-round, and it was signing the Chris Youngs of the world as a free agent, and Colin Cowgill and Marlon Byrd. Those were the guys that he could bring in. Now, potentially, he can do more that would have a more substantial impact. That's the hope. So that's where we're at from a Met perspective. As far as the team this year, there's no other way to say it. It's a big disappointment. When you have a year where 16 teams make the playoffs, you thought the Mets should have been good enough to be one of the 16. If the Miami Marlins are good enough to make it, and it's still not completely settled whether they're in or not, but the expectation is they will be. But the bottom line is if they're able to make it, the Mets should be able to. And the fact that they're 99.6% not going to make it is a big-time indictment. And I know they're technically still alive by the slimmest of margins, and don't get your hopes up. But this season is a big disappointment, and the biggest culprit you look at is the pitching. Once Noah Syndergaard went down during that long offseason, you knew it was going to be a struggle to fill that void in the rotation. And then when you factor in that Marcus Stroman didn't do anything this year, and Steven Matz had probably the worst year of his career, it just wasn't enough to get the job done. And they hit at a level this year where they could have not only gotten in the playoffs, but made a run if they had the pitching that they did years ago. But with the Mets, it always seems to be a year-to-year thing where one thing clicks, the other doesn't. The next year, the other thing clicks, and the one you were looking for doesn't. So, we'll see what the future holds. Hopefully, brighter times are ahead. They'll finish out the string here in Washington. They got a win last night, and David Peterson went against the mantra of poor Mets starting pitching because he turned in a really nice rookie season and capped it off in his final start with 7 good innings and a win over the Nationals yesterday. They got some offensive production from Robinson Chirinos, and they go on to a win. So now they'll finish out these last 3 games. I guess the only thing left to watch is Jacob deGrom, who you hope could win a 3rd straight Cy Young, but I think the odds are against it. One, he just hasn't quite been as deGrom sharp here the last couple of starts. He had the one game in Philadelphia where he lasted 2 innings and then left with the hamstring issue. Came back his last start against the Rays and struck out 14, but still gave up a couple of runs. So I don't think he's going to win it. I think Trevor Bauer has it in the bag after his last brilliant start against the Brewers, and he's pitching to an ERA well under 2 now on the year. And there's just too many other guys in the mix for it to be a consensus Jacob deGrom award this year. So still hats off to him on another terrific season, and, too bad that he couldn't be the 3rd pitcher ever to make it 3 straight Cy Youngs, but we know how good this guy is and how important to this franchise he is, and, maybe if he turns in a no-hitter in his final start, the narrative will change, but the Mets will finish out here in Washington, final 3 games of the season, and then you hope brighter times are ahead with the new ownership potentially on the reign, as long as he can get the approval from the majority of the rest of the owners. As for the Yankees, who I'll touch on briefly, because there's not really a whole lot there. We know they're going to be in the playoffs. As of now, they stand at the 5 seed if the season ended today, which I don't like that expression, because the reality is the season doesn't end today. But if it did, they would play the Chicago White Sox in what would be a very intriguing series, and I think you could imagine the ball might leave the yard a couple times with those 2 lineups going head-to-head. But the Yankees will finish up here with Miami. Marlins still very much a lot to play for, as they have not locked up their postseason spot. The Yankees back home, where they play much better. The road struggles have been well chronicled this year, and another series lost this week against the Blue Jays. They fell yesterday by a 4-1 final, as that clinched a playoff spot for Toronto. So for the Yankees, it's really just a final tune-up before the playoffs, and we talked about them getting healthier now. They've gotten Judge back and Stanton back and Gleyber Torres, so they went through the majority of the year without pretty much all of their big stars, and, they've gotten them back at the right time. They got hot, as we talked about last week, when they just annihilated the Blue Jays at home. We know they're capable of hitting the ball out of the ballpark with regularity, and if everything clicked, this team is good enough to win the whole thing. The problem is it hasn't clicked on a consistent basis, and their lineup at times can seemingly be very feast or famine. Recently, it seems like you look at every Yankees score and it's a blowout. They're either winning 14-1 or they're losing 10-2. I mean, they had the one close game in Boston that went extra innings, then they blew them out the next game, and then the Red Sox come back and blow them out. So it just seems like they're kind of trading blowouts here lately. But overall, you'd have to like the position they're in as they hit the postseason. Who their opponent will be is yet to be determined. If somehow it could be the Minnesota Twins, which now looks unlikely because they're playing well, but you just know how the Yankees feast on the Twins. It's almost just unfair. 16 straight wins in that matchup in the playoffs. But if they get a White Sox team that's very much inexperienced, we'll see if they're able to take advantage. Final 3 games here of this regular season at home against the Derek Jeters and the Marlins. And now I want to move into the postseason outlook, especially as I mentioned on the National League side, where there is still a lot to be determined, because unlike the American League, where we know 7 of the 8 teams, the only one that is yet to clinch is the Astros, which, believe it or not, leaves the Angels and Mariners still alive. But we fully expect the Astros to clinch and be final spot there in the 6th seed. The National League, though, there are only the top 4 that have clinched. We know the Dodgers, Braves, Cubs, and Padres. Congratulations, all of them in the playoffs. The other 4 spots yet to be decided. As it stands now, they are as follows. The Cardinals are in the 5, Miami 6. The red-hot Cincinnati Reds have gotten into postseason positioning at number 7, and currently the Giants hold the 8th and final spot in the National League. 2 teams on the outside looking in. Phillies a half game back, the Milwaukee Brewers 1 game back, and I guess still technically alive, the Mets and Rockies, even though we know how that goes. So a couple things to note. The Brewers and Cardinals are going to play each other this weekend, and they have a doubleheader today in St. Louis. So that would set up the Brewers nicely for a chance to make it if they're able to, say, sweep the series or win 3 out of 4, because with the doubleheader today, it's a 4-game series. The problem is I just am not too high on the Brewers. I just don't like what I've seen from them, and the first problem is a guy that's a superstar, and Christian Yelich is just not having that kind of year. So the offense has been very difficult to come by with this team, and I just don't think they've done enough. I have to believe the Cardinals. It's a team that, while not overly talented, and I haven't necessarily been impressed by them, they just have a culture of winning, and you put them in a spot where they need to win. Generally, that's what they're going to do, and so I would favor them in that matchup. And you're telling me right now they would be matched up with the Padres if the season ended today. While everyone loves the Padres, and I do too, rightfully so, they've been one of the teams of 2020. But you're telling me there's no chance the Cardinals could win that series? I'm not buying it at all. Look, these are a 3-game series. This is baseball. Anything can happen, and I think we're going to see some results that we don't necessarily expect. Now, I wouldn't tell you the Cardinals are definitely going to win, but you couldn't see Jack Flaherty going out in Game 1 throwing 7 dominant innings and then the Cardinals finding a way to win one other game. Certainly not out of the realm of possibility. And like I said, that's a team that just seems to find a way, even though you look at them and you're not overly impressed with anything that they have, especially offensively. They have a culture of winning, and so for that reason, they're still dangerous. Just look at last year. They played the Braves, team that clearly looked head and shoulders better than them. They went out in a deciding Game 5, put a 10 spot in the first inning, and never looked back. So for that reason, to me, I never discount the Cardinals. Then you go to the Marlins, who, to me, it would be a travesty if they didn't make the playoffs, because you look at them this year with all that they've endured right out of the gates with the COVID-19 team-wide outbreak, and a team that, let's face it, everyone thought it was still another rebuilding season. And for them to get off to the start they did, they reeled off 7 of their first 8. They've consistently been a winning record this year. And look, while I don't love this team being a Met fan and them being a team that has broken the Mets' hearts on many occasions, as we know, I just think this is a year where you want to see them in. They've been in position just about the whole year. It would be a shame for them to ruin it in the final week of the season. But they got a tough matchup. They got to go to Yankee Stadium. You know the Yankees would like nothing else than to ruin things for Derek Jeter's group there. So that'll be interesting this weekend. Then you get to the Reds, who are the team that is on the rise and has been hot of late, riding that trio at the start of their rotation, which has been great. The aforementioned Trevor Bauer, probably the Cy Young winner. Luis Castillo has been on a roll, and Sonny Gray, we know, has found new life since putting on the Cincinnati uniform. Interestingly there, they take on the Minnesota Twins at Minnesota, where the Twins have been great. So that's a very interesting series to see if the Reds can hang on to one of the final spots. And then finally, the Giants, who play one of the doubleheaders today, they take on the Padres. They're at home. I think the Giants are going to hang on here. I think they're expected to get Mike Yastrzemski back in the lineup. That's a big boost for them. He's been so instrumental to their success this season. And I just think they've done enough. They've been a surprise with all that they've been able to do offensively, getting some big-time standout performances. So I think they find a way. Then the only other team is the Phillies, and gosh, you talk about a team that has just blown it this year with that bullpen, and it's a team that I was buying all through the offseason. I like what they did. I like Joe Girardi at the helm, but when you have a bullpen that, as Jason Stark noted in his last column, has made every opposing hitter look like Joe DiMaggio, the collective numbers of what the Philly bullpen has given up to opposing hitters matches a slash line of one of Joe DiMaggio's seasons. So that is how bad their bullpen has been. That their bullpen still could have been really bad, and this team still could have been good enough to be a postseason team, but it has been historically bad, and even with that, they're on the cusp. They're a half game back, and they got the Rays this weekend. We know that's always difficult, but if the Phillies find their way on the outside looking in after Sunday, they know exactly where to face the blame, and it's the kind of season that could cost a general manager his job in Matt Klentak, because he didn't do enough. You know, he made some moves in hopes that it would get better, but the guys he brought in from the Red Sox have both been not getting the job done, and it's just been a collective failure from that group. And when you give Bryce Harper the contract that you did, and you have Real Muto, and you have other pieces, and you're good enough certainly to win offensively, and something goes horribly wrong, like the bullpen, I just think it's going to be a team that looks to make some changes, potentially at the GM spot. So that's where the Phillies are at, still very much alive, but I just don't know how you can trust them. It's a team that, like I said, I put too much trust in, but I can't sit here right now and say they're going to be one of the teams to make it, just because of what we've seen day after day with that bullpen. And it has just continued game after game. We saw it most recently in the National Series. You figure we're playing a Washington team that has nothing to play for, has already been eliminated. It's a season where they basically, I don't want to say threw in the towel, but it was a World Series hangover year, let's put it mildly, for the Nationals, and for the Phillies to blow games even after taking the lead in extra innings and still giving it up. It's just been tough to watch down in Philadelphia from that standpoint. So a lot of intrigue for the National League. If I had to say right now, I'd say that the teams that are currently in the spots are going to make it. I favor the Cardinals in this series over Milwaukee, and I just don't have the heart to pick the Phillies. I'm going to stick with Cincinnati, who's been hot even with a tough matchup this weekend, and the Giants as well. So a lot to be decided. Should be fun. And then we'll begin the postseason in earnest on Tuesday, where we're going to have a NCAA-style tournament as far as baseball goes. When you look at Wednesday and Thursday of next week, 8 games on the slate both days. It is going to be wall-to-wall baseball, basically from 12 noon to 12 midnight. So for a baseball fan, wow, that's going to be fun. And with that, I'm going to run down the notable matchups for Friday. I'm going to skip over the games that don't have any significance as far as any playoff teams going head-to-head. And even though the Mets, we know, aren't going to make it, I'll still give you their matchup as they're in Washington, and it'll be Rick Porcello making the start tonight, and he's opposed by Max Scherzer. The aforementioned Brewers and Cardinals doubleheader. Game 1 begins at 5:15 with Josh Lindblom opposing Daniel Ponce de Leon. And Game 2 from Busch Stadium will feature the Cardinals ace Jack Flaherty matching up with the left-hander Brent Suter for the Brewers. We'll skip down and go down to Tampa Bay. That's where the Phillies will be, and Vince Velasquez toes the slab against Charlie Morton. Marlins and the Yankees. The matchup from the Bronx tonight is Sandy Alcantara against Jay Happ. And how about Happ? Very much under the radar, has just been pitching great of late, and I don't think anybody has paid much attention. Pirates and the Indians from Cleveland. That'll be Mitch Keller against Carlos Carrasco. We only have the Padres probables for their doubleheader in San Francisco. Chris Paddock will go in the first game, and Dinelson Lamet, who's one of the Cy Young contenders in the National League, will go in game number 2. Reds and the Twins, series with a lot of intrigue. Tyler Mahle against Jose Barrios. We'll get the second installment of the Chicago series, this time from the south side. Yu Darvish against Dylan Cease. The Angels and the Dodgers from Dodger Stadium, where the Angels very quietly now in the last 20 games are 14-6. See, I started talking about the Angels early on in the season where there was nothing good to talk about. The problem was they got off to such a bad start that nobody noticed them the rest of the year, but they actually have picked it up. Now, does that mean anything going into next year? See, the problem with that is you get off to a bad start, all of a sudden you don't have any pressure on you, and you can just go out and play fast and loose, and that's what the Angels have done, and they've gotten a lot of good individual performances. You obviously know about Trout, but Rendon, after a bad start to his year, is right up among the league leaders in wins above replacement this year. He's basically having another Rendon-esque season, but we know the pitching has come up short, and the biggest culprit for me with the Angels is Shohei Ohtani, making absolutely no impact. He made a couple starts, barely got anybody out, then he got hurt, and offensively he hasn't made any kind of an impact either. So when I look at the Angels' failures, yes, you look at pitching collectively outside of Dylan Bundy, who's given them a nice season, but the fact that Ohtani has not been a star is, to me, the biggest problem with the Angels this year. And Clayton Kershaw will go for the Dodgers. And look, the Dodgers have all the ingredients to win the thing this year. The problem is they just have had their shortcomings in the playoffs, but I mean, there's no excuses this year. They have all the pieces in place. There's no weaknesses with this team, but you get matched up in a 3-game series and a best of 7 eventually. Anything can happen. And the Dodgers, to me, more than anything else, they just need a little bit of luck. And finally, in Oakland, the A's will welcome in the Mariners. Yusei Kikuchi against Chris Bassett. So those are some of your matchups for your Friday, including locally. And now we'll move on to this day in baseball history, where, as I mentioned, it comes from the recent past. It was on this day in 2014 when Derek Jeter said goodbye to Yankee Stadium in legendary fashion. In his final at-bat in his final home game, Jeter was the hero when he singled in the winning run to give the Yankees a 6-5 victory over the Orioles. And real quick, who did he drive in? Now, it wasn't one of those star players from the Yankee past. It was, of all people, Antoine Richardson. Yeah, that's right. And that moment dubbed from the Yankee broadcaster Michael Kay as when fantasy became reality. A game that all of us in this area and pretty much any baseball fan, I think, was watching at the time, and one that was obviously memorable in a year where the Yankees didn't even make the playoffs. And finally, for the 9th inning today, where we have a couple notable retirements to mention, I'll start with the one that was more recent news breaking just yesterday when the longtime member of the Kansas City Royals, Alex Gordon, has decided to call it quits. A fine career for Gordon, very much an interesting career, because when he first came up, there were expectations of him being the next franchise player, playing the same position that the legendary George Brett played in a Kansas City uniform, and Gordon was showered with that kind of praise, being a former number 2 overall pick, being a guy from that area, Royals fan growing up, University of Nebraska, and early on, it just did not click for him. It didn't work at third base. He struggled mightily offensively, but he just found a home once they moved him to left field and became one of the great left fielders. 7-time Gold Glove winner, and once he made the transformation as far as his position, I just think it opened things up for him, and he became a much better all-around player. The offense started to come. He had a nice stretch there from about 2010 to 2014 where he was a really good offensive player, and then of course became a World Series champion. We know here in this area he had a big hit or something like that against the Mets. Details won't be provided. But hats off to Gordon on a terrific career, lifelong Royal, and really in many ways embodied what that franchise is about. The hustle, the gamer mentality he had, and like I said, just something to watch as a defensive player. Platinum Glove winner, just a good all-around player, and being well recognized after he announced his retirement from around the game. And then the other was a manager also in the American League Central, where last weekend we learned Ron Gardenhire was going to step aside. Longtime manager, all those years in Minnesota, where his teams were very fundamentally sound year in, year out. Lately, he's been tasked with guiding this rebuilding Tiger team. Unfortunately for Gardenhire, some health issues have derailed him recently, and so he's called it quits. But another guy, baseball lifer, who's had a terrific career in the game. And now we'll see where the Tigers turn for a replacement. There's a long list of candidates reported by a couple of the national writers, including one, A.J. Hinch, who there's a strong belief is going to get back in the game, considering all he did in Houston. Yes, we know that there is now some baggage there, obviously, but you figure Hinch will get another chance. Maybe it comes in Detroit, or maybe they go with another direction from someone they had play for them. Marcus Tim's name has been mentioned. He's currently the Yankee hitting coach. Don Kelly, who's on the Pirates coaching staff. So we'll see where the Tigers turn. But Gardenhire calls it a career, and a good one it was. So that will do it for this edition of the Brian on Baseball podcast. Enjoy your final week of regular season baseball. Incredible that we've reached it this fast. Doesn't feel like we should be saying goodbye already to the regular season, but 2020 has brought unexpected challenges, as we all know, and the playoffs are going to be a lot of fun. We'll be on next week. Don't know which day yet, because my schedule is a little bit different, but we'll be on to break down all the matchups, and we'll have plenty to dissect, so it should be a lot of fun. Our thanks, as always, go to Dylan DePrado. Thank you for listening today, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at Brian Goudsward. Thanks again. So long from Middletown, New Jersey. Have a good weekend.